Thank you all for coming. So, as you know, our speaker tonight is Paul Miller, who you probably all know as DJ Spooky, the Subliminal Kid, who has, of course, produced many CDs and has worked with many eminent people such as Chuck D and Yoko Ono. He's also the author of the book Rhythm Science and has edited another collection called Sound Unbound, right, if I recall correctly. And he's also the author of a new book called The Book of Ice, which is primarily why he's here tonight, and we'll be discussing that. So our discussion in part will talk about the new book, but also talk some about his thoughts about music and writing and these kinds of avenues. So without further ado, Paul Miller.
Okay, this is kind of open. Okay. Yeah, tonight what I wanted to do is riff on a couple of projects that I'm currently looking at, and from the viewpoint of kind of thinking about literacy and landscape, and what ends up kind of being a tension between the two, because of course you all are writers. One of the first things that you're going to probably be seeing as a reference point in my work is this idea of phonography. The phonograph as a kind of a device from the late 19th century that has radically changed our relationship to the idea of how we think of recordings and how we think of the live act, or the idea of something happening in real time versus the tension between the recorded document that creates that kind of an echo chamber, so to speak, in modern life. So as the 21st century has unfolded, we've realized more and more that we live in a media ecology. And what people have found more and more is that the live experience has become kind of a secondary situation, because most people experience the mediated aspect of something, the secondary recording of it, the edited document of it, this YouTube or cell phone projected and edited, downloaded kind of echo of the live thing. So my work relates a lot to that from the viewpoint of how DJ culture has kind of become an art form of editing. And when you think about the notion of sampling, what you're thinking about is a culture that's essentially a folk culture of recordings, where people play with, edit, transform, and above all, edit material to the point where it's a collage. And so collage, density, layering, all of those are things that have a literary reference point. And if you go back to the term phonograph, which I was talking about earlier, the term phonograph essentially is broken down into two words: phonetics of graphology, writing with sound. So what I want to do tonight is unpack some of my projects and material from the viewpoint of sampling and collage, but reverse engineering it throughout the 20th century, and kind of looking at the 20th versus the 21st century. This is a funny photo. I was just at South by Southwest Festival a little while ago, and I was hanging out with a gentleman by the name of George Clinton, who was the lead singer for Parliament Funkadelic. They're one of my favorite groups of the late 20th century, and what's wild is very interesting is I was showing him how to DJ a little bit using my iPad app, and we were live on CNN. And so it was kind of a very charming moment where someone who was a live musician was realizing that you could sample, layer, cut, and edit. So I was showing him how to DJ using Funkadelic records. So he's like, "Oh, that's my voice," you know. And it was kind of a very charming moment where you realize that when people hear themselves recorded, they have a different relationship to that versus the living, kind of person. So Sigmund Freud, in the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, liked to call our era as a kind of an era that had an uneasy tension with how people think about the live act. But above all, if you fast forward to the 21st century, this idea of the unheimlich, the uncanny, has become the kind of root experience of the 21st century. When I talk about the uncanny, I'm saying that this notion that memory and satire have become kind of the basic vocabulary of how people think of these shared experiences that shape and mold modern life. So this is a mashup, a remix of Obama and President Bush's faces, like realigned in Photoshop. Now, it doesn't take a certain kind of literacy to get that as a sense of humor, but what it does entail is a literacy of images. Now, I like to call it the Photoshop imagination. If you do the same thing with sound or with video or with any medium, the idea of the mashup becomes more and more part of the folk vocabulary of the 21st century's digital imagination. So my most recent book is called Sound Unbound. And I took a studio to Antarctica and went to several of the main ice fields to do what I call acoustic portraits of ice. And what's fascinating about Antarctica is it's the only place on Earth with no government. And I wanted to figure out some ways to think about environmental issues from the viewpoint of digital media and electronic music. But above all, wanted to think about what happens if you take someone from the deep city and put them in one of the most remote parts of the planet and see what happens with their creative process. So when I was in process for that project, I did an artist residency at Dartmouth College's Arctic Studies Research Labs. And I started studying how ice forms. So what you're seeing here is the core ice molecules that make up any kind of ice at all. What's fascinating is you're seeing a hexagonal shape that's involved with certain layers of permutation. You can easily see there's a hexagon that has been folded in on itself, and there's a kind of recursive logic at work with any snowflake or ice crystal. And when I was walking, I'd carry a studio in a backpack and go out into these huge ice fields and do photographs and drawings and document the material. And the idea of a journal was the first idea of the book, but eventually what it became is a group of graphic design compositions relating to music compositions and above all relating to how people think about documenting a journey. So in the 19th century and early 20th century, graphic design and music composition began to be more and more in dialogue. This is one of my favorite composers, Cornelius Cardew. He has a great series of works where essentially he was taking graphic design and trying to think about how music could be taken outside of the norms of how people think of notation. So if you fast forward to our time, one of the areas that really fascinates me, or one of the areas of our culture that fascinates me, is symmetry. Now, what you're seeing here is what they call a shepherd's tone. It's ascending and descending music motifs, but you can easily see the symmetry at play. Now, if you compare this to the snowflake I was just showing, this is a kind of musical interpretation of symmetry, but it's also about tonal progression and sequencing. So what I want to do tonight is unpack some of the issues from the viewpoint of a composer, looking at landscape and thinking about how landscape affects the generation of how people think about the modern imagination. So the book, I carried a studio around to all these ice fields. And I was thinking about electronic music and the urban landscape and trying to document things in a way that was really about evoking the landscape. And so sound is a very ambiguous part of our culture. It comes with certain conditions and contexts. I'll give you one. Most hip-hop tracks you're going to hear are in 4/4 tempo. Same with house music, techno, dubstep, drum and bass, you name it. That 4/4 tempo is a kind of quantized rhythm that reflects some of the digital media issues of why people respond to that tempo. So if you listen to classical music, if you listen to jazz, other forms of music have different tempo patterns and ranges, 6/8, 4/4, 3/4, different meters and so on. So why does electronic music have such a deep relationship to the 4/4 tempo? That's one question I'm going to leave up in the air. Above all, electronic music is a reflection of the urban landscape. And one of the things that went through my mind when I was in Antarctica was the vastness of the ice. Antarctica has around 70% of the world's fresh water, and the continent itself is covered with 90% of ice. So to get a sense of scale, comparing the human figure walking through these immense landscapes, that was something that's really important to me to convey both in the book and in the compositions. So not only are you thinking about technical terms in classical music like ostinato or arpeggio, but you're thinking about this idea of recursive logic and pattern recognition. So in hip-hop, what's one of the amazing things is that people will look at the metaphor of ice. Again, if you go to a writing class, you can imagine several books that have the title Soul on Ice, Iceberg Slim, and so on. But black culture loves ice. People were saying, why do you want to go to Antarctica? And I was like, black people, we love ice. And it was one of those moments where when you start seeing the patterns that shape and mold ice, I started thinking about the way that metaphor had come up in so much of black culture. So in the 20th century, there's a gentleman by the name of Iceberg Slim. Many consider him to be the DNA of hip-hop's sort of lyrical take on things. And he would always have these photographs of him sitting on huge piles of ice. And it's a funny kind of quirky take on that, is that once you get from the physical metaphor of this, the molecular structure of ice and the density and the layering, and then go back to the poetic metaphor, you can still see a connection, and that's about composition. So when I think about what is a composition, it's a group of selections that have been edited and transformed into a sequence. So with my book, one of the things that started as a kind of a foregrounded thing was the idea of sampling. When we were there, I was there with a group of scientists who did what you call ice core sampling. And what they were doing was digging into the ice to find out what was in the air and what molecular structures had been left, what dust and pollens and other forms of pollution. So they used the ice as an archive. And as you dig down every couple meters, that's several million years of time. So it's like a piece of amber that's captured whatever was in the air. So the ice in Antarctica has been undisturbed for millions and millions of years. So you can think of it as a huge record, a document we all share. So one of my favorite mathematicians is a gentleman by the name of Johannes Kepler. And in 1611, he was on his way home, and he saw a snowflake land on his sleeve. What's fascinating about snowflakes, as I was showing you with those ice pieces earlier, is they're precisely mathematical renditions of certain algorithms in nature. So he went home and wrote a book called The Six Sides of a Snowflake, which is considered to be one of the first mathematical treatises of nature, looking at how patterns are generated in cold. So the snowflake's built on hexagonal shape and a recursive logic. Same as with electronic music. Recursion and repetition form the basis of our culture. So tonight, hopefully, I'm walking you guys through some of the issues that drive the work. But above all, I want you to think about how sampling has reflected some of the issues that has driven a 20th century versus 21st century ambiguity between memory and the way it unfolds in digital media. So say, for example, I'm working on a couple projects looking at nature, and whereas I was talking about portraits of landscape, in the 19th century you had the German neo-expressionists, but you also had people who were writers like Mary Shelley, whose famous proto-modernist novel, Frankenstein, it was written in the Swiss Alps. And this piece is called The Wanderer Above Fog. And the way that nature informed a lot of the early 20th century's ideas of the uncanny. So in terms of portraits, you have to imagine a portrait of a place gives you a sense of very specific relationships that people can decode. Time and space, how the painter responded to things, but above all, how a portrait creates a tension between what was then and what is now. It creates a portal, a wormhole between the past and the present. So whenever you're in a museum, whenever you're in an art gallery, you're playing with a sense of ambiguity. The artist has created a text or a document that bears a lot of codes about that current moment that the artist was working in. So with this piece, I was fascinated with the way the German naturalist movement was trying to think about nature and purity, and then comparing it to Johannes Kepler's essays, Six Sides of a Snowflake, for my Antarctica project. So if you fast forward from 1611 to 2011, several hundred years have passed, but one phenomenon remains intact, which is that ice is still very cool, right? So I'm really interested in how Kepler was able to translate a very scientific process in a very crude time. I mean, he didn't have the same instruments we have now, but by being able to infer, the mathematics of the snowflake, that essay became one of the most influential texts looking at mathematics and nature. So Johannes Kepler is a big hero for me, and he was one of the inspirations for a lot of the songs that are going to be on the album project. So when I was in Antarctica, much of what my work was looking at was, okay, if we have motif and landscape, and we have this idea of a place where essentially we're seeing symmetry, like I was showing you earlier, this is a shepherd's tone. It's ascending and descending. But I also was looking at other artists like M.C. Escher, and this idea of recursion and visuality and the way layers and loops work. So there's a very famous book by Douglas Hofstadter called Gödel, Escher, Bach. It's kind of the book of loops. And if you think about loops and repetition in the 21st century, this is kind of one of the most incredibly repetitive times in human history. I mean, we're repeating so much, and the density of the repetition is so much that we're kind of numb to it. And so this tension between originality and the copy, or the loop and the repeat and the repetition of the repetition, I think MC Escher really got it very early on. Because what does that happens, when this hits, when it impacts on architecture, when it impacts on design, and when above all it impacts on the literature of our era. So another of the inspirations for this was James Joyce's takes on the portrait of the artist, again going back to that term, the portrait, or of course Portrait of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde. But there's certain texts and novels that where the portrait of what's happening influence, I think it's just a vast spectrum of how people respond. That's what this book is about. So when you look at Mary Shelley's, Frankenstein, the main creature ends up in the Arctic, and jumps off the ship onto a huge piece of broken ice and drifts away into the Arctic currents. That was a really profound image for me. And Frankenstein is one of those novels where the creature itself was made from samples, fragments of people that have been sewn together and been given an electrical current and then given life. That's a remix, So the remixable self, the identity of a creature made from fragments. Now we would just call it a mashup, So the pun here is that as an artist, I'm very interested in not only appropriation, but the new palette that we can think of as we move further and further into the 20th century. The palette is not about color, it's not about physical materials, but it's about information aesthetics and data sets. So when I say a data set, and then we're going to jump into one of the composition I want to just play for you guys as an example of the evening. When I was there, I collected data about the temperature differentials. This is from 2008 on up. And what you can see is those numbers have been transcribed into a musical kind of parallel, the pitch and amplification, envelopes, and so on. And then turned into weather graphs and transcribed into algorithms. And then what I ended up doing was breaking those algorithms into previous kinds of motifs and elements. So I started sampling other composers' work, like Vivaldi's Four Seasons, Handel's Water Music, Bach's Goldberg Variations. But above all, thinking about this idea of motif, layer, and loop. So it's a long story, but to go from this gentleman's piece here to the data set aesthetic of here, you have to think about how information has transformed visuality over the last century. So I want you guys to not think about this as the kind of only about visuality, because if you go back to when I began the discussion, I was talking about the term phonograph, which simply means phonetics of graphology, writing with sound, phonograph. So this next piece that I want to play, I'm going to be joined by a wonderful violinist, Adriana. What I want to show is a kind of a funny update of what Thomas Edison was thinking about when he came up with the concept of the phonograph in the late 19th century. So when Edison was working on the phonograph, he didn't think that the phonograph was going to be used for music at all. In fact, he felt that it was going to be used for dictation machinery, so that you would be able to get rid of your secretary. And amusingly enough, he felt that these kind of playback devices would just be kind of a triviality. What's incredible is that the phonograph changed the way we listen to music from the ground up. Once you could record and document and edit a sound, it was a very short amount of time till you did the same thing to moving images, to moving anything. So Edison had a kind of a similar logic for his early film machines, the kinesioscopes and so on. So let me just play a very short video. Just give me 2 seconds before we jump in. This is a minute long. And what you're going to see is someone working around the same time as Edison, Méliès, and he's making copies of himself. You'll get the idea in a second.
En 1900, il y a donc presque 100 ans, Méliès représente ce qu'il était réellement dans la vie, un homme orchestre.
So that was from 1900, and it's called One Man Band, homme orchestre if you speak French. But the idea there is that he was sampling himself, making copies, project it, do a sense of choreography, project back, and re-edit and re-edit and re-edit. This could easily be the Outcast song for the Hey Ya video, you know. So what's fascinating with the 20th versus the 21st century is that the network effect has really transformed the imagination. And when I'm talking about the network effect, I'm talking about the idea of value. When I say value, I'm thinking about this notion of open source digital media. And when I was talking about symmetry earlier, one of the first things human beings look for is symmetry. Symmetry in a face, symmetry in sound, symmetry in a building. And asymmetry is one thing that human beings fear. And in fact, there's a lot of psychological studies about that. It's a long story. I'll leave it for somebody in the audience who's a psychologist. But symmetry and sound is something that it goes back to certain other kinds of values. And one of my favorite theoreticians of value is a gentleman by the name of Adam Smith. In the 18th century, he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, or Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. And one of the most famous essays in that was called Of Water and Diamonds. So the piece you're going to be hearing is called Tide and Tariff, and it's going to be a pun on this idea. Bits and pieces of the album are going to be available in a couple months. But what I want you to think about is, this is a question he asked himself. He said, why is water that is essential to life free, whereas diamonds, which are almost useless, cost so much money that kings would go to war over them. People will murder over them. Wars happen over them. So he did it's called a paradox of value. Diamonds, which are very scarce, generate value just by that scarcity alone. Whereas water, because everyone has access to it, has a value that approaches zero as more and more people have access to it. So if you think about digital media, we live in the culture of the copy. And so, say for example, if you go to a rich person's house and you see a Picasso on the wall, that's an emblem of wealth and status, but it's also an emblem of scarcity. So imagine the same thing applied to a text, and that's what you're going to be hearing in a moment. So I've been working with Musicsoft Arts and Apple, and last year alone there were 25 billion apps downloaded through the iTunes App Store. And what's been fascinating about that, working with Apple, is that the network effect is applied to a similar thing, where you have to think about the culture of the copy as moving more and more towards the value of zero. So when I was working on my iPad and iPhone apps, one of the things I wanted to do was look at the origin of the phonograph and start taking that apart, much in the way that Thomas Edison was trying to think about the phonograph in the 20th century versus 21st. So everything on this iPad app is about taking the functionality of a physical device and making it become software. That's the code that I read. So there's EQ, effects, looping, layers. We even did a fun graphic design take on the record crate, the hip-hop terms, digging in the crates, and then make it become available for free on the iTunes App Store. And at this point, we've had over 11 million downloads. So we've been, it's me and Bjork are usually one or two of the only artists in the top 50 of iTunes app downloads. So we've had a great run with it, and what it does is this. You're able to pull anything you have on your iTunes library directly into your iPad app, and being able to pull that in, you can mix video, you can mix sound. Say, for example, if I was at a party and wanted to mix YouTube video clips, because you have the video out on the iPad, so you can start VJing using the material, and you can also pull anything from what you have and make different kinds of playlists. So the playlists become record crates. You tap those, you pull them in from your iTunes, and of course, if you're DJing live, you can start pulling stuff from iTunes if you're on a 4G or 3G network. So you don't necessarily need a physical record crate at all anymore. So what you're going to be seeing in a moment is a live dialogue with two turntables and a violin. There's a very famous phrase, two turntables and a microphone. So the pun here is we're looking at a new kind of digital literacy. We're looking at one where the network composition, the material generated by these networks, reflects off of not only selection and sound, but off of the archive itself, and this new kind of archive. So, you ready? Okay. And by the way, I have 2 copies of it, so I'm going to be mixing the beats back and forth. You'll hear it. It's a long story. Adriana Mateo. So what's fun about writing the music for this is I get a chance to work with such incredible musicians. So thank you so much, Adriana. So the role of the composer in the 21st century, to me, the way we organize sound is really incredible because you have to imagine it's about associative context. Now, psychologists have studied this and the idea of the riff. One of my favorite theoreticians of that is Oliver Sacks, who has a very famous book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And these are some friends of mine who've developed an app that lets you, say, for example, organize everything based on the letters that go into how you think of. So they're these kind of word clouds of sounds. And say, for example, if I wanted to kind of just start seeing the way, I have an associative context for each link. Each of these is just kind of ones that they make into different planetary orbit systems. So you can see the other songs, how much you've played them, the ones that relate to the other sounds. And it's a quick way of referencing your sounds and samples. And I love the fact that we have this way of organizing language as it applies to the digital imagination. So the app itself has really transformed the way people think of creativity. And like I said, we've had over 11 million downloads of the DJ Mixer app I was showing you. And it's a very intuitive interface. So one of the things that comes to mind with the notion of how the app is changing literacy is that kids are growing up thinking about the app as a playful interface into how they think of the digital landscape of culture. So the reason I call that piece Tide and Tariff is that I was on this Russian ship called the Academic Ioffe, and we had been facing the Antarctic coast, and we were there for about 6 weeks, 1 week of transit each way, and then going back and forth on some great bits and pieces. Long story. It took a while to get there even. But Tide and Tariff, open media and closed systems. How do we look at these paradoxes? So that's going to be one of the lead singles on the album. And it's an album that's a book. It's a book that's a museum show. And it's a museum show that's a digital media landscape. So when I was working on the book, we made a series of projects about new music composition. I'll just show you what she was just playing so you get an idea. And the app version of the book looks at how graphic design and what they call augmented reality kind of interact. So when you think about design and the idea of a book, one of the things that first comes to mind is graphic design is our way of tracing and rerouting much of the way that we think about literacy. So when you think of a book, one of the first things I wanted to do was enhance the literary aspect with performance. So with the Book of Ice, working with Apple, putting it on the iTunes store under my DJ Spooky name, one of the fun parts of doing that was I got a chance to play with the idea of how music composition unfolds. So say, for example, what you were just seeing, those were loops and layers where I'd taken the graphic design score and then broke it into pieces for gallery show. And these were large-scale paintings, by the way. When you went into Robert Miller Gallery, this show is still touring. It's going to about 5 to 7 museums over the next year. And this year, I'm the first artist in residence at the Met Museum. So I'll be doing a whole thing about graphic design and music composition. So the idea of loops and layers and what happens with that idea of collage and sampling, those are 3 or 4 variables that go into any work that I'm thinking about. So when you look at people like Nam June Paik, when you look at people like Jeff Koons, when you look at writers like Marshall McLuhan, and when you think about what happened with people like William S. Burroughs with his cut-up technique, all of them reference this notion of a destabilized narrative where appropriation and fragments have become the norm of how we build our vocabulary. So in terms of an environmental kind of situation, what I wanted to do was base the book project on complexity as it applies to information aesthetics and say, look, what happens if a composer is based loosely on how people respond to the turning of a page? What happens if a composer responds to the risks and impacts of climate change? And so I worked with Dartmouth's Cold Regions Research Labs, worked with them to generate my data sets based on the material I gathered when I was in Antarctica, and then made a physical book like this, which is very 20th, in fact, very 16th or 17th century, really, versus this idea of the e-book. And I worked with a quantum physicist named Brian Greene, who wrote this book, The Elegant Universe. He's probably one of America's top quantum physicists. And the idea was to generate data sets that could be turned into compositions. So let me just show you some of the QR codes that go into these sections here. So each section is prefaced by a QR code that when you hold your phone or your iPad up to it, it generates all of the material that's inside. And what you can then do is that QR code takes you to kind of an app-like version of the book. And I'd like to play you 2 video clips that kind of let me focus some of the material that I developed and turned into music compositions. So this is going to take 1 moment to load. It's kind of fun to work on this because I know you guys are writers. And the pun here is that Phonograph simply pulls apart or breaks down the distinction between the written word and the musical word. So just leave it at that. Here we go. So what was so beautiful about going to this kind of remote but vast place was the way the landscape kind of really, really, really made you turn your cell phone off. You know, it's one of those. So when I was hanging out in these kind of spots, I mean, if it's so cold, if you fall in the water, you die in about 2 minutes. So trying to figure out high definition photographs, high definition take on the cinematography and the compositions. So I had a couple terabyte hard drives and basically went there and just was hanging out. That was me. I took my hat off because it was really, really, really cold. But I thought it would be a cool photograph. And you had to wear these kind of weird high-tech gear for like climbing ice mountains and stuff. But you know, it's a funny thing because when I got back, the QR code prints that I started generating from that project were all about thinking about what would a writer do with the data? You know, how would someone make a novel out of that data? How would someone create a story? And I was like, well, you know, the best way to tell that story would be with sound. So recently, I got approached by, you know what, I'll show you one other kind of example of paradox because sound and like landscape. So yeah, I'd go hiking up to these huge mountains. It took 8 hours to walk from that water all the way up here, and you're on the side of a mountain. Just so you can see the scale, it looks like a nuclear bomb has gone off, and those are mountains that have been stripped bare from the ice. So I was kind of looking at that Caspar David Friedrich painting, The Wanderer Above Fog. But above all, just thinking about landscape, you know, and how composition and landscape reflect off of one another. And so I started, you know, I was doing a lot of photography while I was there. And it was just incredible because the kind of spatiality, you know, I was like, all right, this is not hip hop as I know it, you know, it's definitely, when you think of, you know, Kanye West, you know, he lives down here on Houston Street, you know, or if you think about techno coming out of Detroit, or if you think about sampling and collage, it was difficult to kind of hit the reset button on my creative process. I got a lot of writing done. The sun does not set when you're there in the Antarctic summer. You know, when it's winter here, it's summer there, and the sun was up for about the whole 4 weeks that we were physically there on the continent. So my dreams started getting kind of geometric. My sleep pattern started getting weird because I couldn't go to sleep because the sun was up all the time. And what ended up happening is just generating a lot of material that was based on the ancientness of the place. It felt like you could feel billions of years of time out of the ice. So my previous film, I'm going to just show one last example, and I guess we should open up for discussion. My previous film, I got, it's a long story, I got the rights to D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation from 1915. So I've been looking at how cinema shapes the imagination, and I wanted to figure out an update for that, for a counter-propaganda for climate change. I don't, if you guys have been reading or following the Republican debates, you got to wonder, like, what planet are they on? You know, so to make a long story short, one of the masters of propaganda was D.W. Griffith, and he defined our notion of ethnicity and how people think of ethnicity as it plays out on film. So I don't know if you guys have been following, say, for example, The Hunger Games, where a lot of people felt that the main characters should have been killed off, but they were black women, so they didn't care, and there was a lot of racism back and forth about the definition of the identity of the characters. That's still a straight out of Birth of a Nation. Or Avatar, where you have a white, you know, character who goes to this planet of people of color who are blue, but then he gets down with the people of color, and then he becomes kind of like a Tarzan update, you know. Or if you go, you know, to Birth of a Nation, where it's mainly whites in blackface, the rise of the minstrel show, and the kind of, or D.W. Griffith also did Asians in yellowface. So he was one of the guys who really set the tone for racial politics in cinema for most of the 20th century. So when I got the rights to his film, he left his estate to Harvard and to MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. So one of the major concerts for that show is we got the Greek government to give me the Acropolis for an evening, and we projected the film throughout the ruins, and I put a big sound system. You know, you can see those are big bass woofers. That's a person there, so you can see the scale. Those are really, that's a lot of bass, you know. So we had a sold-out show. About 5,000 people came to the show. So I said, you know, hey, everybody, thanks for coming to the show. I think I'm the first DJ to play here in 3,000 years. Thanks for coming out, you know. And, you know, it was one of those moments where you think about this idea of permanence and impermanence, you know, because human beings, we build structures. We think of ancient monuments as permanent, but nature will outlast us all. So the pun here is how does the artist in the 21st century, especially from a hip-hop or multicultural point of view, looking back at post-colonial aesthetics, kind of rational aesthetics, because nature and the environmental aspects of what I'm doing For me, the politics of ethnicity, the politics of race, class, social hierarchy, gender, those are things that shape and mold any artist or writer's creative output. And D.W. Griffith, to me, this was like a serious mashup because the way he defined ethnicity for most of the cinema of the 20th century, it's really important to, as we move further into the 21st century, to understand the past better. So that's what I think remixes are. So I'm going to end with a piece I just did with Sci-Fi Channel, and I think you guys might find the irony of this kind of funny. Sci-Fi Channel took my Antarctica project and had me remix it for, oops, shit, I hit the wrong one, sorry. For Sci-Fi Channel. And we did a series of interstitials. So the pun here is, how do you get people to imagine someplace else, you know, because the reframing of the imagination is what's so important to me right now. Reframe equals remix. So when I start my residency at the Met Museum, which has one of the best archives in the United States, I'm going to be remixing the museum and thinking about the idea of impermanence and transience as a series of happenings. We'll have writers, artists, physicists, molecular biologists, you name it, come to the museum and work to remix the ideas around art, literature, and design. So this is what you guys saw was earlier, like the art mix, and now this is like playing like, I don't know, after Battlestar Galactica or something, I don't know.
Let's imagine the things we see every day in nature actually contain secret sounds. DJ Spooky went to Antarctica, and where others heard silence, he heard music. He took the visual patterns of the melting continent and created a living symphony. You've heard that the environment is changing, but you've never heard it like this. DJ Spooky imagined greater.
Your turn.
Go to let'simagingreater.com.
So, I mean, the Sci-Fi Channel is kind of fun because it's like, it's about the near future. Everything's like really crispy and high tech. So you'll be seeing these kinds of like Antarctica kind of themed bits and pieces. I didn't want to do a full-on show. I thought it'd be kind of fun to spread it between all the shows and then have remixable clips. So the project became called Let's Imagine Greater. And anybody out, the Sci-Fi Channel has been really into it and they've been playing it a lot. So it's, that just came out like, I don't know, a couple weeks ago. So the pun here is you have art and literature and writing existing in radically different mediums, and how the writer, because I began mainly as a writer and artist, DJ Spooky was meant to be a character. It was never really meant to be my main thing. And so the pun here is I took my name, that Subliminal Kid, from a novel by William S. Burroughs called Nova Express. So I sampled from Burroughs and then remixed it and made a DJ character out of it. That character started making mixtapes, and those tapes became popular in New York in the ancient mid-90s. So my peer group, people like DJ Shadow, DJ Crush, Cut Chemist, Danger Mouse, the list goes on. We all make nicknames. That's the point. It's like you're taking a name and then remixing an identity. And so the pun here is this is not just about sound, but it's about a literature of how people are expressing digital culture in general. So with that said and done, the book Vice just came out. And, you know, I guess we should open up to discussion or questions. I don't know how you guys want to. So, thanks. When you say 6, you're thinking, what, the molecular structure is hexagonal. But actually, hexagons are pretty interesting because it's about pure geometry. So when you see a snowflake, you're essentially, I'll just show you really quick. When you see an ice molecule, what it's done is it's done patterns and layers on itself. So it packs very efficiently space. So the mathematics is quite clear. But what's cool about that is the way, when you say 6, you're just seeing whenever you walk in a puddle or whenever you breathe air, which is, you know, has H2O, you know, oxygen, there's a relational to how the body itself is made mostly of water. So water and ice are pretty much just reflections of one another that form at certain temperatures. So it wasn't just about 6. I mean, you can play with the pattern. There's more formal pieces on the album project that I'm going to be releasing in a little bit that look at the mathematics directly, like 6, 6, 6, 6 times, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, everything based on that hexagonal code. But I wanted to generate more material, so we found out how snowflakes form by looking at Kepler's equations, and then I could generate mathematically. These are just fractal math based on taking permutations of the code that would generate the hexagonal fractal. And these are just kind of lead you straight into a kind of Maxim SP patch that I was able to develop that took that geometry and assigned it to different tone patches, and then I was able to generate stuff that comes out of nature. So it's not just about the tempo, but about the granularity, texturality, what they call the pitch envelope of a sound. There's a lot you can edit in there. It's based on that geometric shape. So if you go back to the beginnings of music, tuning systems in a Western context come out of ancient Greece. So a lot of the Greeks felt that mathematics and music were actually just mere reflections of one another. So those tuning systems have, her violin versus what I can program, they're still about the same tuning systems that somebody would have been able to play, pentatonic or, all the different scales and stuff like that, but just the math code of it. So there's a lot you can do. Anybody else? Uh-huh.
I guess I had kind of an elaborate question.
Sure.
So you are working with a system now where, back in the ancient times of the mid-90s, you were sitting there with your physical creative records, and you were probably sitting there with, the symmetrical instrument, your two turntables, and your mixer in between, this perfect symmetry. And then you were, had your, your BPM record on one side. You're wearing your headphones, and you had, whatever records you're going to play that night or the next day, whatever. You're matching the beats and calculating that yourself. Now it's like you can DJ on your iPad. You don't need the headphones. I saw you can visualize the beats right down the middle. I mean, granted, instruments like that have been around for a long time, but now it's something that DJs have accessibility to. They can have this visualization down the middle, and it's just perfect. You don't, you can just match the beats visually. And I mean, you're working a lot with this dialectical analysis between sound and image. I mean, how has that evolved for you in the last 10 years, say,
Well, a lot of the work has come out of this idea of remixing. And when I say remixing, looking at the history of remixing, if you go back to several centuries ago when you had Martin Luther, take Gutenberg's press and be able to make copies of his 95 Theses and post them on and create the Protestant Revolution. On the other hand, the museum of the 19th century was called the Wunderkammer. So people are pulling bits and pieces of a museum to create a collection that was meant to create wonder, or but the anthology is another kind of parallel. When you pull an anthology or collection of essays together, you're making a mixtape just the same. So those tools are metaphors. I mean, I really think that the printing press has been around longer than the phonograph, but they both have had the same impact. But the iPad app, there's been over 25 billion apps downloaded, and so each app is a different kind of music instrument. So say, for example, it's like you're seeing a new kind of guitar or a new kind of piano every couple hours because people are making so many apps, and so I can play a piano on that. I can transcribe the MIDI code of that piano, put it in different patches, generate beats, generate violins, tones, run it through video sampling software. You can do, multimedia installations just off of that with a couple riffs I just made. Turntables, the funny thing is that's all possible because revolutions in computing. And your average computer didn't have the same processing speed and power as the iPad even a couple years ago. So, you're seeing Moore's law applied to culture, So if you can do more with smaller instruments, that's going to be a revolution in writing. I'm really happy to celebrate the ebook and the rise of the ebook. But I also think that when I was working on the Antarctica project, I wanted to, as much as possible, incorporate multimedia. So when you hold your phone up to the QR codes in the book or in the ebook, it takes the phone or iPad into different multimedia layers and stuff like that. But yeah, the tools still come from this collage aesthetic. And the 70s and 80s, when turntable culture was just beginning, it was about the social space. People were in one room listening to certain kind of rhythms and styles. If you were into rock, if you were at like a Andy Warhol art rock party, you had Lou Reed's band playing, and then you had a couple other DJs playing or something. Or if you were into disco, you'd go to see Grandmaster Flash or something. But, as the 21st century has evolved, we're looking at this idea of the rise of the app as a non-location-based entertainment situation. It's not, when I say location-based, everything from GPS tagging to the way apps like Twitter or Foursquare have shaped people's social relationships. These days, when you're DJing a mix, it's going to be recorded. People have their cell phone. We also made my app, I'll just show you really quick. If I hit the red button here at the bottom of the screen, it records the mix live and sends it to either SoundCloud or to, there's a kind of a iCloud mix app that anyone in the room can download it. So we call that function the Wi-Fi party. And it's kind of a fun thing because you can pull video, record mixes, re-edit the sound, and then anyone who's at that party at that same time can download it to their phone and just go home with that mix. So it doesn't matter where they are. And geography is getting more and more, kind of a very abstract, asymmetric relationship to the recording. So these are things that a lot of theoreticians have been trying to figure out. There's Pierre Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital on one hand and the idea of free culture versus some of these people who are critiquing copyright law as well, because who owns the memories of these things? So when I was looking at this idea of ice, it's a natural system, it's who owns that. And the literature around science of that is really a compelling place to begin a dialogue about open culture, because nobody owns ice. I mean, it can be made anywhere. Antarctica is the only place on Earth with no government. So these are kind of fun provocations to kind of get to nudge people out of normal DJing, because at this point, even my mom's DJing, everybody's DJing, who cares? But no disrespect to my mom, but it's like how I want to try to do something a little bit different and update the game a little bit. Amon Tobin just did a 3D DJ tour. Did anybody see that? No? Okay. He's part of my peer group. A lot of DJs everybody's getting visual now, so when you go to most shows, you're going to be seeing a radical kind of visuality and overload, and the screens are getting bigger, and the projectors are getting bigger, and they're doing architectural kind of, I'll just show you one concert I just had in Italy, where we did 3D mapping of an entire building that I was DJing. You can see the projection surface is being controlled by my iPad, and those are these huge palaces. But at the architecture of the building, I was able to change the structure of the building. It looked visual. I mean, it was incredible. But this huge palaces behind me were being controlled from the stage. And you can do all this really immersive 3D projection. So you're going to be seeing a lot more of that. But in terms of literature, I'm really intrigued with how people are trying to figure out the future of the book. And that's an important issue for me right now.
You want to say more about that, actually? What is the relationship for you between digital culture and writing?
Well, yeah, a writer is someone who documents an experience and gets that experience onto the page. And I think right now we're trying to figure out how or what that page is at this point and what the document is. And digital media has transformed a kind of instantaneous interaction with that document. And that document can go in a lot of different directions. It doesn't have to just be words. I mean, you can take that text and transform it into architecture, take the architecture, transform it into song, take the song, make an artificial DNA sequence. Anything is possible as long as the data set corresponds to what, the original version was. And in fact, forget the original version. You don't need it anymore. Once you have the copy of the copy, the idea of it, something that's original, it kind of fades into the distance. So the book, as we know it, and as our parents know it, it's very interesting. I mean, I think I have a lot of friends who are writers. I have a lot of friends who are artists. Everyone is very concerned about everything from copyright law to ownership of ideas and the vocabulary that generates those ideas. And so what I wanted to show you really quick is this is from Cisco Systems. And these are online piracy numbers. I don't know if you guys will be able to see it out there. But the whole pun here is who owns memory. And the online piracy is just eating alive the normal music industry. And digital music versus digital literature, what's fascinating is publishers no longer need to pay for shipping and storage. So that's brought the cost of producing a book down to basically producing a file. So that your books should be cheaper, but they're still charging $9.99 or even more for an ebook, which is highway robbery if you really think about how little it takes to promote and you don't have to store the file anywhere except on a little digital hard drive. But people, that's what I'm saying, they're still applying a 19th and 20th century model of the physical object. So it's important to me to kind of look at those paradoxes and explore it. So books are still cool, I collect them. But Just like I collect records, have actually come back because they're more collectible because they're more scarce.
Other questions?
Oh, you guys are shy. Oh, hey.
No,
hello.
well, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about how DJing has kind of transformed to being, like you were just seeing you in, I think it was Greece or something, it was very live performance.
Oh, yeah, with the Acropolis.
Oh, yeah, and so how, do you feel that it might change where, okay, so if music is free, then live performance, how is that valuable? You know, how does that change? Because, I mean, artists still have to survive and I'm sure sustain themselves, so.
No, live performance has become more important than ever. In fact, that's why you're seeing more and more concerts of like bands are doing reunion tours, there's limited edition versions of everything. Bands like Pearl Jam will record a concert right after the concert's happened, and as the audience is leaving, they're burning CDRs of the concert so that you can take it as you leave the show. You know, these are very swiftly changing times, and if you think about what Spotify is doing on a huge level, the idea of the archive we're just at archive fever, like fever pitch of documenting and recording and uploading and updating everything. And there's more data being generated now than at any time in human history. But, you know, when you say live, like say for example the Gorillaz, which is kind of an art rock, art dub, hip hop group, they recorded videos of themselves as cartoon characters, and they don't tour live at all. They just project from wherever they are. So their home studios in London, or Radiohead just recently did an online New Year's Eve party where they were at their studio and just played, and they had millions of people, you know, tune in.
Yeah, but do you see that as the same experience that you would get as something live? Because I still find, you know, getting that live interaction, still feel it as opposed to watching it on a screen at home.
No, that's a good point. I mean, the rise or the dominance of the idea of the screen is really problematic. I mean, a lot of people want to have the human interaction of watching other people in a room, and I think that's fine. There's a paradox because my nickname, DJ Spooky, was taken from this idea that you press play and there's nobody there. You know, like, so I could be anywhere. It doesn't matter. In fact, I could be a hologram, and I'm sitting at home in this, you know, it's just like you're just kind of watching an echo here. But the live experience, monetarily speaking, concerts are making more money than ever. There's lots and lots and lots of concerts of every possible style of music every day in every major city on the planet. I mean, it's a 24-hour, 7 days a week industry that's booming right now. So it's not like the live experience is collapsing. It's the opposite. In fact, more people will hear recordings and then use those recordings as a kind of a flag to go and see the band. You know, so by having more material online that people can compare and contrast, it actually helps musicians' careers quite a bit. But you're going to have to tour. You can't be in one city anymore. You have to travel. I travel more than ever, like right now. But when I'm in New York, I'm losing money. You know, so. What do you want to?
I would just say, what if someone was to sample you? How would you feel?
Oh, it's happened. I've never sued anybody, and I've never been sued. And you know what? I'm glad you brought that up. If we can dim the lights, let me play one last clip, which is from Copyright Criminals. It's a project I just did a little while ago, and I'd love to just kind of leave with that note in mind. And basically what we did was kind of looked at interviewing a lot of people from different parts of the DJ and electronic music scene. All right, here you go. It's going to take a second to load. But yeah, ownership of memory, of sampling. Yeah.
Say someone recorded this sound. So does that mean they own it if I go?
If you sample one note of a sound recording, it's copyright infringement.
It's actually taking sounds and meshing them together and putting them all into art to come up with something totally different.
By ignoring the rules, they came up with a whole new way of thinking about music.
Always buying records, searching.
That bass line.
We grab conga sounds, trumpet sounds, violin sounds, drum beat sounds, and remanipulated and created our own music.
Basically, when I'm sampling, I have all these artists. They're in my band.
You can't just have a record that's made up of everybody else's records and they're not paying for it.
You pay for guitar, you pay for piano, you pay for anything else that you make a song with. At the end of the day, the court said, not only is this copyright infringement, but we see criminal prosecution in line for this one.
Some of those first sample cases, De La Soul, Bismarcky, P, and others, it wasn't that they were trying to be thieves or trying not to get caught. It was just like, we kind of didn't know.
Sampling was a very intricate thing for us. It was creating a collage.
We kind of looked at music as an assemblage of sounds, and we felt that you couldn't copyright a sound.
Well, welcome to the Teledome.
So many groups and sample last night. They say I'm the world's #1 sampler drummer, so hey, I haven't got a penny for it yet, though, but I'm Clyde Stubblefield, the original funky drummer.
His name never appears on any of those compositional credits. He doesn't get royalties. He got paid for the time in the studio.
My music is my life.
Look, nobody took hip hop seriously until it started making a lot of money.
And naturally, the lawyers moved in.
It became kind of a peaceful flip.
People were getting sued for music they were making.
Yeah, I got sued for sampling my own stuff. I've sued and I've been sued. That's the nature of the business. For me, I felt like, wow, we're popular now. I'm getting sued by somebody I don't even know.
You're either rich enough to afford the law, or you're a complete outlaw.
If you can catch me, then I didn't do my job.
They got so much technology today, they can just speed go up or whatever they want to do with it. And I don't even know it's me.
Look at how any bit of culture is made. It's about taking bits and pieces of your influences and forging them into something newer and stronger.
That's how society moves forward. It doesn't just invent new things. It evolves through taking old things and changing them.
Go ahead and sample whatever you want.
So that film, me and some friends of mine, Kimbrew McLeod, he's a great, I really think an interesting figure for copyright law. I helped with that, and I'm in it, and so they're friends of mine. So I like the idea of saying that multimedia and collage and sampling are folk culture of the 21st century. So it's really important to kind of view it as not just about sound, but about ideas and memory, and looking at this idea of the gift economy, you know, giving and exchanging material in a way that normal copyright law just can't. The way the law is written versus the way we live are just parting ways.
I want to weigh in on that if I could. So, you know, I'm a great believer in sampling, and I also teach, I always hear writers or people who know how to steal in proper ways in some ways. But, you know, I do have a question about, in terms of writing, when does sampling or borrowing become theft? I don't know if any of you heard about this major lawsuit recently. This black woman won this huge lawsuit against the Wachowski brothers and Joel Silver, who did the Matrix films, and you know they made $2.5 billion on the movies, and now she's entitled to a huge chunk of that money. I mean, you know, it's the hugest copyright infringement settlement in Hollywood history. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
You know what? Let me look that up for a second, because I didn't. Yeah, I don't really have much of a.
Just in general,
what's her name?
Sophia Stewart, right there.
Okay, so why is she suing them?
She won the case actually. She because basically she submitted a story to them that they used as a basis for the Matrix and never credited her.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay.
Wow. hold on 2 seconds. That's pretty interesting, and I think it's a really compelling and pretty wild story. I'm shocked that I don't know about that one. There's so much going on. God damn. Wow, shit. I should know about that one. Sorry, you heard it here first. I did not know about that.
Weirdly enough, I
Yeah.
heard about the settlement of the case through Stanley Clark, the bass player, a few
It's
weeks ago.
$2.5 billion. Me and her need to talk. Okay. All right, good for her. Well, you know what? Before I could really comment on that, I need to kind of dig a little bit into that. But that's incredible.
What are your thoughts in general, though, about this question of when does, in terms of a writer at least, when does borrowing become, I hate the term copyright infringement, but when does borrowing become something more? We can all say that, Borges and others have made that argument about there's no such thing as an original story, and I would agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, you could say any story that we're talking about now has to have its roots in other aspects of a history of narrative. So even if people didn't speak the same language, you have the character who's like a trickster, like Loki or Anansi, or you have Odin versus, Zeus or something. They're from radically different parts of the world, but people seem to have pantheons and divinities. Those divinities, everybody makes up stories about them. They become part of the fabric of folk culture. Who could say who owns copyright on that? But on the other end of the spectrum, if you look at stuff like the song "Happy Birthday," which are actually there's a lot of contested copyright stuff. In fact, I believe Disney bought it, and by rights, by law, if you sing "Happy Birthday" in a public space, you're supposed to pay them money, but nobody, So the way the law is written versus the way we live have parted ways, and in fact, it's unenforceable. So I think for people to respect the rule of law, we need to understand how it impacts on a digital context where appropriation and exchange and accreditation and so on, citation, quotation, those are things that are part of the DNA of the way we live right now. But I just think the way the law is written is still based on like a 19th century production of physical goods and copies of books, which it just doesn't work.
Question there.
She's supposed to.
The discussion about the copyright laws and such reminded me of a quote by Fran Lebowitz, and she was talking about her writing process, and she would look at the dictionary and realize that every word she needed was right there, just in the wrong order. But under that idea that you can't own the words, so to own a story, I was thinking about that.
No, that's a great metaphor. And if you think about the role of the components, the building blocks of anything, it's those building blocks for me it's kind of like ancestor worship. Like there's a very famous phrase, "building on the shoulders of titans," that Newton used to say. He's like, I didn't come up with anything new. And same thing with Einstein said the same thing. I didn't come up with anything new. I'm building on the shoulders of giants. So most people who are creatives are totally honest about that. They're like, look, what I'm doing is a permutation of something that somebody's done, but it doesn't mean that originality, it doesn't exist. It just means that originality needs to be reviewed and understood as a kind of relationship to history. It's nothing ever just arrives out of a vacuum. And that's why I think sampling is more honest as a kind of a creative process in a way. It just says, look, I was influenced by that record. Let me go back to that memory and see what's up. Same. I'm a big fan. But considering you guys are in the middle of graduate school and looking at academic culture, plagiarism probably is a huge deal right now. And there's people who've written whole novels that are kind of appropriated novels and appropriated works. There's people who are looking at this idea of pillaging the history of something and sampling old books, which is fine as well. I would assume, like the idea of stuff like cheating is a big deal because you're going to take a history of any kind of text and splice it into an essay for an exam, But there's been an arms race between cheaters and then people who are like making a software to track cheating, So I kind of love that stuff because it's so bizarre. Because sampling applied to the arts is one thing, but in an academic and accredited systems, Like, for example, a lot of science journals don't want to let people read articles without letting them pay, so you have to go through a paywall. But then again, if somebody bootlegs an article and leaks it, that's about enriching the information that people have access to, you know? So there's this Creative Commons, there's a free culture, there's above all, I think, the more exchange of information that we have, the richer we are. So, you know, I haven't been sued, and I make most of my work available in one platform or another, or free, you know. So I haven't had any problems. I've had many friends who've been sued. One of the most surreal cases is a friend of mine from college, Shep Ferry. He went to RISD, I went to Bowdoin, and Shep did the Obama Hope poster, and, you know, and he got sued over that, and it's a mess. So I just kind of vet my projects through lawyers, and I've never been sued. But I guess it'd be cooler to be sued, maybe. I don't know. But the only people who really benefit are lawyers. I don't know.
We'll take one final question. Yeah.
This is backtracking a little bit, but you left an open-ended question before. Can you explain a little bit more in detail about why the 4/4 time signature is so ubiquitous with hip-hop and electro and house and trance?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. You know, this is my own theory as an artist. There's sociologists who've studied that phenomenon. There's people like Richard Florida, who wrote this book, Rise of the Creative Class, he studied the metrics of when artists move into neighborhoods and they change them, and you'd be stunned the economics that the arts generate in different regions. But a lot of people trace hip-hop back to Robert Moses's building of the Cross Bronx Expressway, where he tore up the urban landscape, and the highways in general kill off neighborhoods. So they'll cut neighborhoods in half. The Cross Bronx Expressway destroyed a lot of parks where kids used to gather, so they had to switch where they would socialize. And so Trisha Rose wrote a great book on this called Black Noise, about the rise of hip-hop out of this kind of conflict of architecture, design, and the urban landscape. But to me, as an artist, it all goes back to the grid. And the way most American cities, Chicago, Detroit, LA, New York, Washington, D.C., we have the logic of the grid, of the sort of the rationalized landscape. And the music that comes out of that is very different. If you look at England or Rome, or like London or Rome, which there's these kind of wavy, curvy roads, and everything is looping back, and like they were formerly villages that just got like hodgepodge scrambled together. There's a lot to be said for how people can really respond to that kind of process. So one of my favorite theoreticians of that is a gentleman by the name of Marshall McLuhan. And I'm just in the middle of re-releasing his album, The Medium is the Massage. And he went in the studio and had all the main characters, people there, read different fonts. And each font had a different voice in a way that was like italics, bold, you know, Helvetica. And then he remixed that like a jazz tape album and made the graphic design of that apply to each page in the book. So when you're talking about 4/4 tempo, visuality itself, when you think about fonts, the way fonts shape perception of a page, I think of beats as a kind of font. And you can take the structures of those fonts, the structures of those rhythms, and apply the same logic. So say, for example, if I were to play you a dubstep track or a hip-hop track, you might have the same tempo, but the way the beat is tweaked, or the double tempo or the bass line, that would be the equivalent of italics or bold, or, you know, those kind of literary allusions. But above all, with electronic music, the kind of intentionality, once it leaves your brain and is in your hard drive, it's about the network. And so people are going to be able to make copies, they're going to edit it, they're going to splice it. And so I think the editing process of 4/4 is the way we've come to organize space and time in this kind of culture. That's just my own quirky artist take on it. But if you look at, say, for example, Renaissance painting and the rise of dimensionality that comes out of Renaissance painting, it's because they put the grid over paintings and were able to dimensionalize the paintings more. There's a long history of the grid in visuality. But how we organize visuality and how we organize hearing and sound I think, are eerie reflections of one another. So, say, for example, a lot of painting before the rise of perspective, that's what's called perspective painting. Painters were able to use the grid to make more complex material, but it was a very, very, it's like having a very short and concise group of rules to organize something, and that generates an extreme complexity. So the grid actually in the American experience, even if it's a logic of the city, it's generated some of the most complexities in human history. That's my take on it.
I just keep thinking about this kind of interface of how the individual, of how someone would like make, let's say, have that 4/4 grid in their head for starting anything, versus somebody who maybe doesn't think in 4/4, and like thinking about that as compared to how, you know, like you're talking about urban society and stuff, how that's laid the foundation for most people to think like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if like people who like are considered musical geniuses or prodigies and so on and so forth maybe don't have that typical grid that most people do.
Yeah, there's a lot to be argued about that. I mean, a guy who's a psychologist or a neuropsychologist like Oliver Sacks, do you know his work? He wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for His Hat. Mm-hmm. So he does a lot of studies on how people remember riffs. And in fact, a lot of what's called industrial psychology is why people remember a riff of a song. And memory has a lot to go into that. So say, for example, one of the largest music corporations in the world is Muzak. And they'll study how people respond to shopping experiences in shopping malls. Like, if you play noise, do people stay in the room? Do they shop more? Do they shop less? If you play certain motifs and elements. So they've applied that stuff to Spotify, to Pandora, to Last.fm, Rhapsody, Last.fm, and so on. But it's eerie because the human ear can, you know, it's an open place. I mean, you can hear a lot of things, but we only hear a certain amount of frequencies anyway. You can only hear between 1 to 10,000 cycles per second, and once it goes beyond or below that, you can't even hear it. So we only have a very small window into the universe. Same thing with our eyesight. We can only see a certain amount of spectrum. But 4/4 is as a general rule of thumb just seems to be universal. If I'm in China, if I'm in Brazil, if I'm in Russia, if I'm in India, if I'm in Antarctica, you know, we played some beats for penguins for a second, just as a mild joke, but you know, I got to show that photo. Just kind of beats for penguins, and you know, there's me hanging out with a lot of penguins. But you know, the funny thing is that 4/4 tempo. Somebody's got to write a book about that. It's probably not me. I don't know if I have the psychological or analytic patience for that, but I'm sure there's a physiological reason. Some people trace it back to the heartbeat, the way the heart kind of sets a metronome, you know, for the blood flowing through the body, or the way children, when they're in the womb, there's a certain, you know, cyclical processes that go on. There's a lot of theories about that, but nobody's been able to accurately say why electronic music intuitively goes into a 4/4 beat. I mean, you could make it other patterns. All you got to do is program the computer and make a 6/8 beat, or a 3/4 beat, or, you know, 32/16 or 18th or whatever.
Well, I would say it also has to do a bit with dancing.
Yeah, but you could, I mean, like tango is in a lot of weird signatures, you know. But when people sample tango, they put in a 4/4 beat, like Gotan Project, you know, their stuff. It's like tango is like dun 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 dun, you know. But it's in weird tempo changes, and there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, somebody's got to. I bet you that would be some interesting psychoanalysis of like standardization of experience. Like, why do we want to quantize a rhythm? Why do we want to take, like, if you were to, I've been to other cultures, for example, like in Vanuatu in the South Pacific, and you know, one of the things that came to mind immediately was like the way that they drum, and the drumming patterns were really amazing. And these guys all play these kinds of beats off of like emptied out wood, and the wood, one guy would be the bass guy, like boom, 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 and the other people would be playing kind of higher notes and like strange rhythms and progressions that had nothing to do with hip hop or techno or anything. And when I pulled out, there was one time, it's a long story, I was hanging out in Vanuatu and I got initiated into the tribe, long story. So I was showing some of the kids on the island how to make beats, and they all wanted to sound like Dr. Dre immediately. I was like, you know, so that's Chief Kapum. He's the chief of this island where I was spending a lot of time, and I was showing them how to DJ. It was very funny, but very few of them had seen an iPhone, for example. And when I pulled out my phone, they were all like, "Wow," you know. So I was showing them how to DJ with my iPad software, things like that. But I travel a lot, so I actually can compare. But regretfully, that 4/4 tempo, man, people just won't let go of it. it's very kind of intriguing because at the end of the day, I've done projects from Vanuatu to, say, for example, like mobile sound systems with Barbara Kruger. Do you know her stuff? She does kind of graphics and fonts with political slogans, and we set up a sound system that fits in this truck. So that's me DJing using the truck sound system. But you know, things like this are art projects for me. But I like the way she uses text. So she'll print out these kinds of political slogans. Barbara Kruger is probably one of the top artists of the 80s. But it's still based on text, and text meets sound. So I guess if you guys want to continue the dialogue, my Twitter handle's @DJSpooky, and I check email a lot, so I know we got to wrap up. So I just want to say thank you for having me. And the new book just came out. It's in the back. Thanks.
Want to mention the magazine?
And me and some friends started a new magazine called Origin Magazine, and if you buy a copy of the book, I'll give you a copy of the magazine or something like that. All right, thanks.